Get reliable and accurate local news with Inform.com. Inform.com is your trusted local news source with journalists dedicated to keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. Visit Inform.com now.
"14 people, including prominent CEOs and politicians, died on October 30th, 1941, when a Northwest Airlines plane crashed just outside of Moorhead. Only the pilot lived to tell the horrific story." Hi, I'm Tracy Briggs, and welcome to this week's Back Then. The residents of Fargo-Moorhead had probably not even had their first sip of coffee that Thursday morning, October 30th, 1941, when they picked up a special edition of the Fargo Forum the newsboy had dropped at their doorstep. The giant all-caps headline shouted, "14 killed in fiery crash of Northwest airliner here." It was shocking news, of course, made all the more shocking when they realized by the end of the day, not only was this the worst aviation disaster in Minnesota history, but with another crash in Ontario that very same day, October 30th, that day had become the deadliest day in the history of commercial aviation. Northwest Airlines Flight 5 was a regularly scheduled multi-stop flight from Chicago to Seattle. It had intermediate stops at Minneapolis, Fargo, Billings and Butte, Montana, and Spokane, Washington. Its passenger list read like a who's who. Clay County archivist Mark Peel, who's done research on the flight, said, "Flying in 1941 was still an expensive alternative to rail travel. Flight 5's 12 passengers reflected this. All but 2 were business travelers. It carried 3 company presidents, 3 sales managers, 2 prominent business owners, an attorney, and the state chairman of a political party." I will read the full list of the victims in just a little bit. The pilot of the plane was 41-year-old Clarence Bates, an experienced pilot who had logged more than 7,000 air hours. He reported no issues with the Douglas DC-3 until Barnesville, Minnesota, when he started to notice some light ice forming on the wings. But he said later it wasn't enough to worry about. According to reports, the plane was making a routine instrument approach to the Fargo airport around 1:54 a.m. when Bates passed over Hector Field at 600 feet to see if he could break through the clouds. He then circled back over the Red River into Minnesota in preparation for the landing. Later, he said, "This is when the plane started to act peculiar, and I knew something was the matter." The airport never heard from Bates or the plane again. With the airport now out of touch, reports of what happened fell upon witnesses who were in the area in those early morning hours. They watched in shock as Flight 5 crashed on the grounds of the Moorhead Rod and Gun Club, about 1.5 miles north of Moorhead, around 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, this is where I think the story gets particularly interesting. Of course, with these old stories, I always go into the forum archives and find information. Well, this one was no exception. And of course, we had file after file of old newspapers about this plane crash from the day it happened to in the weeks following after the investigation was going on. But what I found so interesting was throughout these papers, the reporters didn't just write the stories about what happened. They actually published the firsthand accounts from these witnesses. So I thought instead of just summarizing what these witnesses said, I'd find a few of my foreign communications colleagues to read the witness statements. So that's what we're going to do here as we continue with this story. The first witness on the scene was E.M. Gregory, an official with the Great Northern Railroad, who tells the harrowing story of finding the dazed pilot, Clarence Bates, who had been ejected through the windshield of the plane upon impact. He had been thrown 250 feet from the plane. He was bloodied and injured, but Captain Bates was trying to make it back to the plane to rescue his passengers and the rest of the crew. Here is his witness statement from Thomas Ivanella.
I was driving to Fargo from East Grand Forks, and about 3/4 of a mile north of the crash scene, heard the plane go over my car. The engine sounding like it was functioning normally, the plane was headed east at that time. Then, as I came to a curve in the road, I could see the plane, which had swung south, was very low. And I could see that it was in trouble and would have to land or crash. I couldn't see the crash, but almost instantly saw flames shot up into the air. Turning off into the road leading into the Moorhead Rod and Gun Club grounds, I ran the car as fast as I could, then jumped out and ran toward the burning plane. I was delayed for a moment by falling into the water in the coulee, scrambled up the other bank and saw the pilot, Mr. Bates, just getting up from the ground about 15 feet in front of the nose of the plane. He was frantic and screaming, "Get them out!" "How do you do it?" I shouted. "Through the door," he replied, pointing to the other side of the plane. "But watch out, because the 4 gas tanks haven't all exploded." I ran around the plane, but it was too hot to get to the door. I went around the plane to see if there was any pounding at the window, but there wasn't, and I couldn't hear any screaming. Bates had collapsed on the ground, and I dragged him further away so he could not be endangered by the flames. It was apparent that those in the plane were beyond help, but I ran back to my car, drove into the Comstock Hotel in Moorhead, and told the clerk to call the Moorhead Fire Department. Then I ran back out there and found that a couple in a car had just started to drive over on the side road. I went ahead of them and ran back to the plane. Bates was on the ground moaning. "We've got to get them loose," he said as I came over, and I had to hang on to him to prevent him from going back to the burning plane. There were just the 3 of us there, then the Moorhead police and others arrived.
The couple that Gregory mentioned running into that night was Eveline Berg, who was listed as a Fargo beauty operator, and her companion Charles Bailey of Columbus, Ohio. The 2 of them had been out at a nightclub that Thursday night when they heard a commotion on the outskirts of town. So they got in the car to see what was going on. I will read Eveline's statement. I guess we got there about 2 a.m. As we were driving up, we could see that the windows and some other markings in the plane were visible from the light and the fire. But in just a few seconds, the whole wreckage was in flames. We got out of the car, and as we were running towards the burning plane, a man who I didn't know hurried past us and grabbed the pilot, just as he was trying to crawl back into the flaming fuselage. I guess he was trying to save the passengers. Charlie and the other man tried to drag him away from the wreckage, but he kept saying, "Go back into the plane, get the people away from the wings, they're full of gas." His only concern was for his passengers. We were able to lay the pilot down on that other man's coat, but he kept trying to get back on his feet to go back to the plane. But he was finally so exhausted, he laid back down, and I was able to hold his head in my hands to help ease his pain. He was bleeding a lot. We were a ways away, but the flames and the heat from the plane were so intense that we couldn't really get even near it. When we saw that the rescue of the others in the plane was impossible, our only concern really was to keep the pilot quiet until help arrived. Well, help did arrive in the form of Ralph Yoder, an ambulance driver who was called to help bring Bates to the hospital. The weather conditions and terrain made it difficult to get the upset and incoherent Bates to the hospital. This is my colleague Chris Kurzman reading what Yoder said.
I received the call from Fargo Police at 2:18 a.m. While I was getting into my clothes to make the run, I called Frank McKenzie, Cass Sheriff, as I was not certain on which side of the river the accident had occurred, and then left for the scene of the accident. As we neared the scene, we could see the flames of the burning plane. They appeared to leap into the air 10 to 15 feet as we reached the road leading into the Moorhead Rod and Gun Club trap grounds. Chief Nick Remley of the Moorhead Fire Department met us. Chief Remley informed me that they had 1 man lying on the bank across the coulee and instructed me to bring a stretcher. He said there apparently would be only 1 person to go in the ambulance. We pushed a stretcher across the creek at the bottom of the coulee, and Moorhead firemen placed Bates on the stretcher and started across the coulee bottom with him. The mud was so deep that the 6 firemen bearing the stretcher had bogged down in the mud, and Wesley Pearson, my assistant, and I had to get into the coulee bottom and give them a lift. We passed the stretcher forward, and then firemen on the far side helped firemen who were mired in the mud to get free. As we were on our way to St. John's Hospital, Bates talked of fog and mentioned something about lights, but his talk was incoherent and we were unable to get a statement as to just what had happened. From the appearance of the plane, it had come down on the northeast side of the coulee and had jumped the ravine. Part of the plane appeared to be on either side of the coulee. After Bates reached the hospital, he immediately was wrapped in hot blankets. He asked a man, apparently an airport employee, to inform his wife that he was all right. He gave his name and address and said he was the pilot. Except for a cut hand, Bates showed no outward signs of injury. He complained of a sore knee and that his neck hurt. It was apparent that he had been thrown clear of the plane when it crashed. After leaving Bates at the hospital, we returned to the accident scene with the ambulance, but there being no further need for the rig, we returned to Fargo.
As Yoder said, one of Bates' requests was that someone call his wife Virginia back in Minneapolis to tell her he was okay. She relived that night with a reporter the next day while visiting her husband in the hospital. As the paper said, in true pilot wife form, she seemed unruffled. Here's Paula Quam.
It was about 4 a.m, and I thought Clarence was calling to say bad weather had grounded the plane and that he'd be late returning to Minneapolis. A friend called first, and then the hospital. They told me right away that Clarence was all right, so I wasn't frightened. I got ready to come to Fargo right away. We used to live in Fargo in 1934. We lived at 13, 33rd, and 4th Street North in what was called the Almond House. The children attended Horace Mann and Roosevelt schools. When we lived here, Clarence and I pioneered the Fargo airport. We were here when we had to carry water to the planes in 5-gallon cans. And there were only 2 benches in the field for passengers waiting for flights. There isn't much to say about the crash. It's just one of those things. And I'm so glad Clarence is all right. He's not resting easily, but he'll be all right.
Of course, the person everyone wanted to hear from was Bates. When he had been brought to the hospital, he was unaware that everyone on the plane, except him, had been killed. They broke the news to the devastated pilot the next day. Now, considering what he had gone through, his injuries were fairly minor. He had cuts to his head and arm, cracked vertebrae, and damage to his right hand and arm. Authorities wasted no time in talking to him about the crash, questioning him beside his bed at St. John's Hospital in Fargo. His account of the night is terrifying, feeling unable to do anything, while the plane he knew so well seemed to be unresponsive to his every move. Here's my colleague, Chris Flynn.
The ice was piling up and the airplane answered very slowly to the controls. But then everything went haywire. I couldn't control it at all. Nothing worked. Nothing answered. I might just as well have not been there, as far as the way the thing acted the next few seconds. And it wasn't very long. It was hardly enough time for me to realize I was going to crash. About this time, we must have settled because I started to see lights. Saw all the lights on the horizon. And I knew we were at a level position from the instruments, and from the fact that the lights were all on the horizon. It was just a few seconds after that we crashed. I don't remember anything from that time on. I had no sensation of a stall. The thing just shook and it didn't fly. That's all. I don't remember anything after that until they were holding me on the ground. I don't know anything else between those 2 points. I don't remember the actual striking of the ground. It must have knocked me out right there. I have no recollection of that at all. I don't remember hearing any noise. I couldn't figure out what was the matter with it. The plane. It was a different condition than I've ever observed before. It could be that something was wrong with the controls, or with the ice condition, or some control surface, or part of the airplane. But I've never experienced that same feeling before, and I've been flying since 1925. I've been working for Northwest since 1933.
After the inquiry, Bates was ruled not to be at fault for the crash. His survival proved to be a blessing for authorities working to make air travel safer. Now, pilots don't often survive crashes like this, so his report of those final moments of the flight helped pinpoint what went wrong and how it might be prevented in the future. The investigators ruled that the cause of the crash was not just the ice buildup on the wings like so many people had presumed, but the inability of the plane to respond with full power. Also at fault, they said, was the failure of the Northwest dispatcher to recognize the seriousness of weather conditions in Fargo and offer Captain Bates an alternative landing site. Meteorologist Daryl Richardson, the director of the North Dakota Agricultural Weather Network, said, given that it was 1941 and with weather information available at the time, the pilot would have likely been easily caught off guard. He said, the temperature dropped from just above freezing to below freezing from midnight to 2 a.m. just before the crash. Also, light fog developed during that time frame, and mist and drizzle were reported just before and during the crash period. All would attribute to icing as the plane was moving into lower altitude. What happened next? Well, Bate would be released from the hospital within a week, and after a short time resumed his flying career. And of course, just a couple of months later, Pearl Harbor happened, so the United States was launched into World War II. That meant Bates was busier than ever with test flying. Almost a year to the date of the Moorhead crash, on October 31st, 1942, Bates was test flying a B-24 bomber in St. Paul when his luck would run out. The plane crashed, and he was killed. As far as those who were killed in the crash in 1941, obituaries filled the paper in the weeks after that, and of course funeral services and memorial services were held for those people. Here are the names of the people killed on October 30th, 1941 in the Moorhead plane crash. Emery A. King, 45, Fargo, president of the Dakota Tractor Company. Ned Wells, Fargo, 41, sales manager of the Dakota Tractor Company. A.F. Simonson, 42 years old, of Grand Forks, North Dakota. He was the owner of several businesses. Helen Ford, of Fargo and Minneapolis. Clark W. Farup, 45, of Grafton, North Dakota, owner of Ford Auto Agencies. Caroline Packard, she was 50, of Atlantic City, New Jersey. She was on her way to visit her sister in Seattle. Henry G. Klopp, he was 68, of Spokane, Washington. He was president of White Pine Sash Company, and he was on his way to see his critically ill wife after attending his mother's funeral in Indiana. Lynn C. Carr, 34, of Highland Park, Illinois, traffic representative for Northwest Airlines. W.A. Metzger, age unavailable, of New York City, sales manager for Royal Typewriter Company. A.H. Brown, 60, of Billings, Montana, attorney and chairman of the Montana State Republican Central Committee. Fred R. Lowell, 38, of Springfield, Ohio, sales manager for the National Supply Company. R.W. Ramsey, age unavailable, of North Canton, Ohio, president of Ramsey Lumber Company. And the co-pilot, Alden Onsgaard, 25, of Minneapolis. Flight attendant Bernice Blowers, 25, of Welcome, Minnesota. Now, here are just a few other interesting facts about the Northwest Airlines crash in Moorhead. The crash in Moorhead was the deadliest in the state's history until 1948, when a Northwest plane crashed near Winona, Minnesota, killing all 37 people on board. Flight attendant Bernice Blowers was engaged to be married. Her fiancé told authorities later that he had asked Bernice to get a substitute for that flight so she could go dancing with him that Thursday night. But she said she felt it was her duty to fly. Both her engagement ring and her wings were found in the wreckage. Co-pilot Alden Onsgaard left dentistry school to be a pilot because he said there was, quote, no excitement in pulling teeth. The plane carried more than 750 pounds of mail destined for Fargo, Montana, and Washington. About 100 pounds were recovered from the wreckage and taken to the Fargo post office, where clerks salvaged about 900 pieces, 898 to be exact. They were readable, but they all had marks from the fire. And finally, page 12 of the Fargo Form on November 2nd, 1941, was a lesson in contrast. Of course, stories toward the top of the page included all kinds of details about the investigation into the Moorhead crash, as well as information about a very similar crash in Ontario on October 30th, which killed 20 more people. But, oddly, at the bottom of the page is a photo of a grandfather giving his granddaughter a plane ticket for her birthday with the headline that read, "Celebrate Birthdays with Plane Trip." Thanks for tuning in to Back Then. I'll be back with another story in just a few days.
Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to Inform.com. Visit Inform.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.